And welcome again to Cottage Talk. I am Russ Goldman. Joining me right now is Peter Rutzler from The Athletic. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Peter, who was able to ask Marco Silva questions at his presser today. So it's really all going to be about Marco's presser, what he learned from the presser, and also some recent articles that Peter wrote. I want to ask him about as well. It's really an honor, Peter, having you on. Thank you so much for joining me today on Cottage Talk.
No problem at all, Russ. As we were saying before, I've been meaning to come on for some time, and it's always difficult balancing time and trying to do the different things. And but yeah, luckily we've managed to sort something out for this evening. You know, even this week, trying to do Fulhamish, and then something comes up last minute, and it's there's always something in the way. But no, it's great to be on, and at last something I know we've wanted to do for a while. So yeah.
We've been hoping to do this for a while, so I'm glad that we could make this happen. And we're going to talk about Marco's presser in detail, obviously talk about his thoughts on the upcoming match against Tottenham. There's a good amount in this presser that you tweeted about, and we're going to really touch on a good amount of it. Like I mentioned, we'll also talk about some articles that you wrote that I think also go along with the presser. But before I get into going into more detail with Peter, always, please, I mentioned this to everyone, please do subscribe on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. Okay, Peter, let's just start with the beginning from the presser today. Just give me your overall view on Marco's mood and what you got out of it. We'll go into the details of his thoughts on penalties, transfer market, safety, and of course Spurs. But just overall, how was Marco today?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, he's with pre-match press conferences, he's very relaxed and how can you not be, I suppose, considering Fulham's position in the table and how the season's gone, and today was no different. There's always that nice contrast between Marco Silva after a game compared to before a game. I mean, if you take Sunday for instance, in the controversies with the penalty and the potential red card that Silva was demanding for the foul on Pereira by Dan Burn. Which I think was a fair grievance. So there's always that bit more emotion, at the end of a game. But cool, calm, collected, good spirits, and I think I've asked Silva about this before, and considering the pressure that most managers, are under most of the time. I mean, you go through the Premier League now. I mean, there's only 3-4 managers that don't really have that pressure, and you put Silva in there. Of course, there's pressure, and he I think I did this in a piece relatively recently. He says he puts pressure on himself, and he wants to put pressure on his staff and the players to keep those performance levels. But there isn't that sort of outward scrutiny, that sense of things are going wrong because things are going so well. So no, good spirits today. Looking forward to another difficult game, of course, with Tottenham. But in general, yeah, it's a good place to be for him, I think.
I agree. And what's interesting here, because I'm curious your thoughts on this, because like you said, I think he's in a good place. And I'll be curious to see and get your thoughts on this. There is talk that Fulham are looking to extend Marco. And how soon do you think that they really need to get going on this, Peter? Because I truly believe the cons are all in on Marco Silva. And I think the best way to do that is to extend him as soon as possible. So what are your thoughts on what's been going on that front?
Yeah, I mean, he's still got 18 months to go on his contract. And I remember asking him about that a couple of weeks ago about the long term, if he saw himself going beyond the terms of his contract. And he said that, it's football. Things can change very, very quickly. And I think there's a sense of realism there, but that on the baseline factors were he's happy working, with Alistair McIntosh, with Tony Khan, Shahid Khan, with the players in particular. He's enjoying it day to day. There's no reason as to why that couldn't work any further. That's the sense you get. And I mean, on the flip side, and you look at from a club perspective, I mean, my God, Fulham are 6th in the table at the moment. It just couldn't be going any better. So, I mean, it's just, it's basically obvious that the Fulham would want him to extend. I think it's no surprise. There's no doubt in there. In terms of, with the actual mechanics of it, I don't think that's something that's going to happen immediately. I don't see anything. I haven't heard that there's anything going to be immediate on that front. Okay. But that's not to say that, it's not that this is reflective of something that's worrying or concerning, because I just don't think that's the situation. We're still in the middle of the season. There's time for it. There's still time on his contract. He's not in the last year of his contract. So all in all, the mood music's pretty good, and how can it not be, I suppose, when everything is going in the right direction? And I think from everyone's perspective, it's a case of just long may it continue going like this. And if it does, then there's no reason why he wouldn't want to stay further.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that, Peter. Okay, so let's get to really talking about the presser. I want to get your thoughts on what he shared about the transfer market. And I think it's pretty obvious. And based on your tweets, he did talk about, obviously, Fulham are interested in right back. But the other flip side of this is that he talked about, and you had mentioned this to me off air, that he mentions he wants to keep all of his key players. And I asked you this, should I be concerned about this? But he was asked a question. Now, I've seen a little speculation with, say, Mitro, Anthony Robinson, Paulinho. Do you think I'm reading too much into that?
Yeah, probably. I mean, every press conference he's asked about incomings and outgoings, and specifically on outgoings. The question is, can you keep your key players? And I think it's one of the first things we sort of asked ahead of the window. There is going to be that. There were those rumors around Robinson start the window, and it's quite clear that Fulham's stance is we're not letting anyone go willingly. You want to keep your best assets together. What they'd want to do in January. And January isn't really a window where you want to make wholesale changes, because if you're doing that, that implies that something's going wrong during the season, which it isn't at Fulham. And I think that the point of view is that if we can strengthen, then we will. But in terms of letting people go, I mean, it's basically a non-starter. And I think and when you look at the key players you mentioned, Paulinho, Mitrovic, they're under contract, and good contracts with good long lengths left. Mitrovic obviously signed a 5-year deal last year. Paulinho's got a long contract. Robinson's one I think that I'm sure Fulham would love to extend even further after the way he stepped into the Premier League, and obviously he's done very well for the USMNT as well. So at this stage, it's just not something they're countenancing. I think it would take something drastic to change that. But in football, things can happen. You can't rule anything out, I suppose. And Silva always says that as well in his pressers. But yeah, I wouldn't read too much into the fact that it wasn't unprompted. He's asked it.
Okay.
So yeah.
It's just me being a nervous supporter. So that's where I'm coming from, because again, I pick up on these things and I'm like, what's going on here? But that's why I wanted to ask you that. But on the positive, what's interesting about this, and Fulham definitely, Peter, and you know this because you've covered them, they tend to do their business late every window. So the fact that I'm really hearing basically transfer speculation about the right back position, maybe a little bit about, say, a striker or maybe some central midfield, but should I be reading not much into what's been going on, because things seem to get much hotter as we get later in the window?
Yeah, I mean, we know that's the Fulham way. As we say, I've covered Fulham only for a couple of years, but
it's going to be a late night again for you.
I wouldn't bet against it, but you don't know. You don't know. I mean, the only sort of concrete one that we, and I've reported, my colleague James McNicholas, who covers Arsenal, that Fulham are talking to Arsenal about Cedric Suarez, which obviously has been rumored for a while, and the state of play that we had was that it's not close yet, because there are a lot of different hurdles to overcome. Is it going to be a permanent transfer or a loan? If it's going to be a loan, then what does that mean for Shane Duffy and Daniel James? Because there's a limit there. I would think it would be gearing towards a permanent than a loan. So then you've got to work out what Arsenal want. And right now, Arteta is not certain about letting him go, because he wants that depth. He needs that depth for their title challenge. So, there's been, talk and rumours about even Frenada, who's at Valladolid, who's a right back. So if he came into Arsenal, maybe that might help the situation. So that's one that's not progressed. There's still a gap. Previously, I think Suarez's salary was a bit off-putting for Fulham as well. So let's see where that one goes. But in terms of everything else, I think it's, I've reported this, about the positions they want to do. Silva's talked about 2 to 3 positions. The main ones are right back, as we've talked about. It has been talked about extensively. and then also in central midfield, I believe. So again, with that stipulation that if they are going to sign someone, it's to add to the squad, it's to improve the squad, because right now the team's in quite a good place. So it's just about, refining the edges, and we'll see what happens. January is a strange thing because things can move quickly all of a sudden. One player can lead to another moving and things like that. So, but yeah. And, and as you get closer to the end of the window, there's a deadline. It becomes more pressing. Clubs are able to move quicker, and Fulham have done quite well out of that, really. So let's see what happens. I'm sure they'd like to do it sooner, but this is the thing with this window, in a way that probably we haven't really seen for a while in January, and not like last year. Well, last year was fine. But in the Premier League, I'm referring to, where there was that need. There's no string with Mitrovic not playing on Scott Parker. Are they going to get someone in? They got Josh Maja in quite late. There isn't that real sense. There's not that panic.
There's actually been speculation about him, which kind of surprised me, Peter. I don't know if you saw that with Josh Maja.
Yeah, I saw that speculation, but I've got nothing further to add on it because there's a lot. I have a long list of names. Nothing further to add on that.
I'm sure it will continue to grow, and Peter does a great job of covering the window. And I will say this probably 5 more times during the show. Please do follow Peter on Twitter. Please, I'm a subscriber to The Athletic. I would highly recommend it. I actually joined The Athletic because of you, Peter. Yes, because of you, I joined The Athletic. I was against it for the longest time because of their coverage over here of American sports. I didn't want to do it, but I knew I wanted to get your coverage. So I started my subscription about a year ago because of Peter here. And I've actually enjoyed The Athletic. So I was proven wrong. It's not just about Peter. They've got some great writers also. And I want to give a shout out to the Fulhamish podcast because they do a great show on Thursdays with Peter, Jack, and Sammy. I look forward to it, listen to it all the time. And I told Peter that before the show. I was actually disappointed he wasn't on the last episode. But, they do a great show. And if you're not listening to Fulhamish, you should be certainly listening to them. But, my friend, let's get going. Let's talk about something else that I found very curious. You keep asking the question, and he just won't touch this question about Europe. Now, I am a fan. I would love to see Fulham get into Europe. People are trying to get me to pump the brakes on it. I probably should. Silva's on the task at hand. It's about safety, Peter, and I think he backed that up again in his presser today.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing with, considering where Fulham are in the table. I mean, again, I saw another table today and just said big weekend for the top 6, and then it has, all the traditional big clubs, and then you've got Fulham in 6th. It still feels surreal, considering the nature of Fulham in the last few years, and it's still quite something to sink in. But this is it, Silva, I don't think is going to change. I think that's the stance they took last year that brought success, even when, trying to point out, you're going to be close to this record about, the number of goals you're scoring, away wins, home wins, things like that. Mitrovic's goals, always keeping on the straight and narrow. And I think that sort of keeping feet on the ground is quite important because that's clearly the message that's going to the players as well. Because if you're altering your horizons, it changes the perspective. And there is and I've been thinking about this a little bit. I wonder how much the players you get that sense of freedom without the relegation threat. Right. The freedom to play, right? The sense that the task is to stay up. We're achieving that. They're not there yet, fundamentally, but you can play and see where it takes you. See where each game takes you. But that's kind of the key thing. Fulham aren't mathematically safe yet. Think crazy things can happen. I can't see it happening, but if you had a load of injuries or something like that, and I just think that's why it's just keep it going. We'll keep performing, and for everyone else, for us looking at it, trying to predict what's going on and writing, because that's our job. You're looking at it going, well, we're halfway through the season. Fulham have played everyone. They are 6th in the Premier League. They've competed very well. Competed very well against some of the best teams in the world, not just in the league, in Europe, in the world, and that bodes really well. It's encouraging. it's possible. And I think the closest Silva's ever got to sort of acknowledging it was after the win at Leicester. I think that was a real gritty performance. We saw another side to Fulham that just, after that great win at Palace, just managed to get the job done somehow. And the fans in the away end were singing, we're going on a European tour, and the players went over and were, enjoying the moment. And you have to enjoy the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Silva said afterwards, like, the fans can dream. And then I spoke to Leno afterwards. He said, well, the fans can dream, but for us, it's we got to keep our feet on the ground here, and that's been Silva's message, and that's what it was today ahead of Spurs. Even though Fulham win, they go above Spurs.
Unbelievable. That is
astonishing.
Truly unbelievable. We'll talk about that match at the very end, but it's fascinating, Peter. And I'm glad that you brought this up. And this is, again, we're limited for time, but one fascinating part of Fulham, and you already talked about it, is finding different ways to win. That to me is what separates this Fulham side than any other side that you've watched. You've been following them now, covering them for a few seasons. This one's different because even last season, they didn't win different ways like this. They are finding different ways. They can grit it out. They can play attractive football. But for me, that just shows that this is not going to be a side that I think is going to fade because they find ways to win, Peter.
Yeah, it's a culture thing, isn't it? It reflects the character within the group that they have these different ways of finding ways to win. I think some of it did come from last season. I think like that Leicester game, that sort of gritty 1-0. I remember back to winning at Hull, that horrible.
That's true. Oh, yeah, that's true.
Cardiff, Middlesbrough. So there were a few, and you could
You're
see,
right.
You could see the sort of those elements of that fed into this year. But you're right. I think to the Scott Parker season behind closed doors, it felt like they were finding ways not to win. And
that's the difference, Peter.
It really is, and that season, for long spells, they were playing pretty good stuff. The Scott Parker's favorite phrase, of course, was fine margins, but it wasn't wrong. Like it always felt, and it's stressful. Especially for supporters, and you're not there to share it in the ground as well, which makes it even worse. It's so difficult. But whereas that team would draw so many games, and it would always be a 0-0 or a 1-1 or a 1-0 defeat. There would always be that just slight tweak. This team have everything in their locker, and that's not just the fact that they have that fantastic philosophy, the front foot playing style that Silva cultivated last year, which we're still seeing in the Premier League. There's also that gritty side, which we talked about, but set plays. And, those 3 matches actually after the World Cup really underscored that. You had the brilliance of Palace, getting the job done. They've gone down to 10 men, to 9 men. We're getting the job done. No problems whatsoever. Played some really good football as well. Then you go to play Leicester, gritty, difficult, tough. You're knackered. The players were struggling. They still managed to get it over the line somehow. And then you play Southampton and score 2 goals from corners. And it's those set plays have been phenomenal. And that's where the likes of Willian and Andres Pereira have made such a big difference. But that's it. They have all these different elements in their armory.
Exactly. And that's what keeps them in all these matches. And for me, it's a combination of all 3. It's the philosophy of Silva playing on the front foot. It's his coaching, and obviously it's the players implementing what he wants them to do. And it all comes together. That's why I see the reason why they've been able to play all these teams tough. I'm going to throw that Newcastle United match to the side at Craven Cottage because of the circumstances. Beyond that, every team, it doesn't matter who it is, they play with no fear, Peter. And that to me is what's so fascinating about Fulham. All right, I have a couple more topics for you. One you actually wrote about that I'm fascinated with. I believe Silva talked a little bit about this. I find it fascinating because this is almost like something that I would see here, that he is picking his center backs based on the opponent. I find that fascinating. That's something that some other sports here that you would see teams do. I don't think it's as common in football to do something like this. What are your thoughts about what Silva shared about the fact that he can mix and match his center backs?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, the common feeling in football is always that you want a frequent and common central defensive partnership. At Fulham, you think of Aaron Hughes and Brede Hangeland,
Exactly.
That consistency. And I think there is still a lot to be said for that. But I think the difficulty, I suppose, for Silva is he's got 3 centre-backs in very good form. And we haven't really seen Shane Duffy, so we don't even know what really he can bring to the table. But you've got Tim Ream, who's just been phenomenal, hasn't he? I mean, the step up in his game under Silva has been incredible. It shows what confidence and support and playing in the right style can do. But then you've got Issa Diop and you've got Tosin Adarabioyo, and both of them have been really good. And I think the fact that the balancing act is you brought Issa Diop in as sort of the marquee central defender. You know, as a £15 million buy. You know, what you want him to play, you want him to show what he can do, and he needs the games to build his confidence and things like that. So it was like when Tosin dropped out, it's like, well, Tosin didn't really do that much wrong. You know, Fulham have been really good. So did they need to change? No, not really. But then Issa Diop's come in and just progressively seems to have got better and better. And I actually thought at Newcastle United over the weekend, that was his probably best performance. You know, I think if it finishes 0-0, he probably gets man of the match for that game because that's how much his influence was. But of course, you know, Diop is now, I think, is certainly the preferred option. It seems that way anyway, because I think he started 9 of the last 11. But there is still that rotation element, which we saw against Chelsea. And the assumption is it just for resting? You know, because Diop, I think earlier in the season when he was swapped out, he didn't play 3 games in a week because he's just building up those minutes. But also, so when I asked Silva, this was last week when I asked Silva about this, and he talked about the tactical strategy, and I said, is it to do with Tosin's passing? Because we know what Tosin can do with his switches of play and things like that. And he agreed. He says there's an element of that. It's to do with strategy. It's to do what these players can do to unpick the lock of an opponent. So it'd be fascinating again to see what that means for this weekend. Silva was asked by another reporter, what are you going to do with the centre backs this weekend? He said, well, you'll find out on Monday.
I read that. I was fascinated that he actually said that. And I like that he does this, but it's not the norm to do this, to basically make a decision on a center back pairing based on who they're playing. I think it's great that he does this. I'm fascinated, though, the way he decides, okay, against this opponent, we need Diop. This opponent, we need Tosin.
It's sorry to interrupt. I think
go ahead.
What's also interesting is, and I remember I did a thing looking at Fulham's tactics last season. I can't remember the name of the piece. Something about how they were the Man City of the Championship, and it really focused. One part was on the centre backs, and just in terms of how important they are to build up, to starting attacks, to moving the opposition press, and being able to beat the press, which is what Tim Ream is really good at. Yep. Tim Ream is very good at. He's a very intelligent player, very good game reader, knows when to play at left to Anthony Robinson, knows when to beat a press. And we saw this against Chelsea actually really well. The amount of times it was just being harried and then he would just drive forward, beat one line of press, which suddenly allows Fulham to move in different directions. And then, of course, the centre-backs have that distribution element, which talked about with Tosin. Can they go long? Can they go short? And that's probably why there is that option to do that. I think I wouldn't say it's like a massive rotation because we've seen Diop become a bit more consistent, I think, in terms of selection. But the fact that Tosin came in against Chelsea was fascinating. And obviously, Diop returning against Newcastle. So what he does against Spurs will be really interesting as well.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating about this, and Peter, I know I'm not alone in this. This summer, I didn't want Tim Ream to be a starting center back in the Premier League. And he's proven me wrong time and time again. Same thing with Jedi at left back. And I give these players so much credit along with Marco and his coaching staff. But the thing about Tim Ream, that I think they've been able to minimize his weaknesses and play to his strengths. Like you said, his reading of the game, I think, outweighs his weaknesses. Would you agree?
It's like anything. To be honest, I think with many players, if you put them in the right situation, they'll look good. It's the same thing with Mitrovic, even you could say 2 years ago. If you put Mitrovic in the system Scott Parker was trying to play in the Premier League 2 years ago, it wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work in the same way. It was trying to be a counter-pressing team with a really quick forward who can run in behind. Silva's system is just designed to get the best out of individuals. It's not overcomplicated. It's built around Mitrovic gets the best out of him, and I think that applies to Tim Ream, because as you say, he's got that support. He's got that understanding with Anthony Robinson, which we've seen on the international stage as well. There's a nice balance between both Ream and either Tosin or Diop, both of which are very good at covering, can also read the play very well, very good in the challenge. Tete's solid. And of course, Palhinha. Palhinha's impact in midfield, changing the number 6 from Jean-Michel Seri to Palhinha.
Unbelievable.
It's locked down that area, and it has given Tim Ream the freedom to do what he does best. And in a ball-playing team, a front foot proactive team that relies on its centre-backs having good distribution, that's Tim Ream. That's what it is. And you put him in that system, and things can work out. And that there's also confidence. the work the manager's done to elevate the players on an individual level. All of those are important as well. But I do think that also it's just playing to people's strengths, and sometimes you get the right result. And that's why sometimes some players don't necessarily fit. Why some don't necessarily work out, because you've got to try and fit into the system what you're trying to do.
Okay, excellent. This has been a fascinating conversation with Peter Rutzler. But coming up next to finish the show, I'm going to ask Peter what Marco said about Spurs in the lead up to this match on Monday night. Okay, Peter, we are limited for time. So just to finish up, I do want to talk a little bit about Spurs. I wanted to talk to you about Mitro and the penalties. I just don't have enough time. We could probably do a half hour on that. But just on Spurs, let's talk about what Marco said about Spurs. And I'll just share my thoughts, and maybe you could share your thoughts as well, just in general. I think this is Fulham's best chance to beat Spurs in a long time.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. Because of the nature of what's been going on at Tottenham, the difficulties that Antonio Conte has had. And we've seen the way Fulham have performed against the big six teams, right. And the way they dealt with Chelsea. I think it'll be a similar sort of environment, atmosphere at Craven Cottage. Silva had said this himself. He wasn't pleased with the way that Fulham played at Tottenham back in September. Was it September?
Yes.
Gosh, time flies. And it did feel like that wasn't their best showing. But even though they weren't great, they only lost 2-1. They still kept within touching distance. And I think a lot of this game will be won and lost with Spurs' wing backs. I think that's where they've had a lot of issues in terms of just either not being able to protect their defence enough or support their forwards in wide areas. Silva talked a bit about Harry Kane and how he's going to deal with that, and the importance of the central defenders, as we've discussed, in stopping him in certain moments when he goes centrally. How do you pass it on to the midfield? I think that'll be really interesting to follow as well. But considering Tottenham's form, considering how they've been doing and the noise around them, it helps. And for Fulham, clean bill of health, really positive vibes despite the defeat at Newcastle, because there's so many positives to take, and who knows?
Yeah, no, listen, it's I'm feeling really good about this match, Peter, and I think all Fulham supporters should feel pretty confident. And listen, I know this is I'm pressed for time, but I just want to thank you for doing the show with me today.
No, that's all right. Thank you for having me on. As I say, we've been meaning to do it for a while, so it's been nice to go on.
Well, I hope you'll join me again sometime. We could, it's funny. Like I said, I probably could have done an hour and a half with you. Neither one of us had enough time. I have so many things I wanted to talk to you about. So that's why I knew I was short for time. But just thank you so much, Peter, for doing this.
No problem at all. And we should definitely do it again.
Okay, very good. And as I mentioned, if you're not already doing it, you need to just again, my recommendation, subscribe to The Athletic and read Peter's articles. I would highly recommend it. He does a phenomenal job of covering Fulham. We're very lucky to have someone of his quality covering the team. Does a great job. And I've also heard very good things from you from, say, Dan Crawford, who's told me wonderful things about you. So, but anyways, I would highly recommend following Peter on Twitter and obviously subscribing. And before we go, always please do subscribe on Apple Podcasts and YouTube to Cottage Talk. It does help other Fulham supporters find us. I do want to say I'm sorry. I know we've had a lot of comments. I was just limited for time to share them on this show, but maybe next time I'll ask Peter to answer some of your questions. We just didn't have the time today, but in a future show, we'll have Peter back. Anyways, well, that's going to do it for this episode of Cottage Talk. For Peter Rutzler from The Athletic, I'm Russ Goldman. Thank you as always for watching and listening to Cottage Talk, now part of the talkSPORT Fan Network.